Chapter 1. The Birth of Light, when Ra created the world. In the beginning, before time had a name and before the stars were born, there was only the infinite, restless ocean of none, a swirling chaos without light or form. Then, as if stirred by some hidden force, a great pyramid-shaped mound rose from the depths. Upon it bloomed a single lotus flower, and from within its radiant petals burst a brilliant light, so pure and fierce that darkness fled from its presence. That light was Ra, the sun god, the first spark of order in a sea of nothingness. Alone and powerful, Ra looked upon the void and decided it was time for creation. Ra's breath became Shu, the god of air, and his spit brought forth Tefnut, goddess of moisture. These twin forces dived into the still primordial waters, exploring what might lie beneath creation's surface. But when they failed to return, Ra's heart ached with fear. From his sorrow came Hathor, who descended to find them. When the twins finally emerged, Ra wept tears of joy, each tear giving birth to humankind. With the family of gods now growing, Ra's creation continued. Geb, god of the earth, and Nut, goddess of the sky, were born from Shu and Tefnut, and their eternal embrace gave form to heaven and earth. As Ra ruled both sky and land, his power shaped rivers, trees, and animals. Among his sacred gifts was the Nile, a divine artery of life. It flowed with the memory of his breath and the blessing of the gods. Around it, men began to build, not just homes but temples, cities, and dreams. In these early days, Ra walked among mortals, revered not just as God but as the first pharaoh. Yet as the centuries turned and Ra's golden light dimmed with age, humans grew defiant. Some turned their worship to Apophis, the coiling serpent of darkness. Betrayed and enraged, Ra unleashed Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, to punish them. Sekhmet's wrath was a storm of blood. Her claws tore through villages, and her roar echoed in the hills. The Nile turned red, not with silt, but with the remains of the unfaithful. Yet when Ra saw the carnage, even he recoiled. He tricked Sekhmet into drinking a river of wine dyed like blood, and as she slept, her rage faded. With his heart heavy, Ra withdrew from the world, retreating to his solar boat to sail across the skies by day and the underworld by night. And thus began the endless battle, Ra crossing the heavens while, each night, he faced the monstrous serpent Apophis in the underworld, fighting to bring light to a darkened world. From Ra's descendants came a new generation of gods: Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. Osiris, wise and noble, ascended the throne and brought gifts far beyond Ra's sunlight. He taught humanity how to cultivate crops, weave linen, shape laws, and bury their dead with dignity. Under Osiris, Egypt blossomed. Fields turned golden under the sun, and cities thrived with harmony. But not all were pleased. His brother Seth, lord of the Red Desert, seethed with envy. The barren sands of his realm could never match Osiris's fertile kingdom, and that bitterness took root in his heart. Seth's resentment twisted into betrayal. At a grand feast, he presented a lavish, ornamented coffin, promising it to whoever fit it perfectly. The guests laughed, seeing it as a game, but when Osiris lay inside, the lid slammed shut. Sealed and trapped, he was cast into the Nile. That very night, the current carried away Egypt's hope. Isis, stricken with grief, began her search. Her tears flooded the river, creating the annual floods that gave life to the soil. But Seth was not finished. When Isis found Osiris's body, Seth dismembered it into 14 pieces and scattered them across the land. Isis, undeterred and devoted, journeyed across Egypt, collecting each sacred fragment. Nephthys, her sister, joined her. With the help of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, they reassembled Osiris and wrapped him in sacred linen. Isis whispered forgotten spells, and Osiris stirred, breathing once more. Though he could no longer walk the land of the living, he became the eternal king of the underworld, judge of souls. In that brief moment of reunion, Isis conceived a son, Horus, whose destiny would be to challenge his uncle and restore balance. Horus grew in secret, raised by Isis in the marshes of the Nile. When he reached adulthood, he challenged Seth for the throne. The gods, uncertain, demanded trials of strength and wit. Battles followed, not just of muscle but of deception, of trickery, of suffering. In one contest, both gods transformed into hippopotamuses, submerging themselves for months. In another, Horus lost his eye. Isis, desperate to end the strife, pleaded for peace, but Horus, wounded and betrayed, turned even on her. The gods watched in dismay as the divine family tore itself apart. Yet Horus's resolve endured. With the help of the goddess Hathor, his eye was restored, more powerful than before. The divine court, weary of the conflict, finally decreed Horus as the rightful heir. Seth was cast down but not destroyed. Instead, he was made to accompany Ra each night, defending the solar bark from Apophis. In the end, even the god of chaos had a role in preserving balance. Horus's reign began, and through his line came the pharaohs, mortal rulers with divine legacy, bridging gods and men. Time passed, dynasties rose, cities like Memphis became centers of power. Yet, the gods remained ever-present, whispering in dreams and etched into stone. Pharaohs claimed descent from Horus. Pyramids rose to pierce the heavens, their shape a symbol of the primeval mound that birthed creation. Their construction demanded not only brute force but faith, a belief that death was not the end. Mummies preserved bodies, sarcophagi bore faces of kings. These tombs were vessels, waiting to be awakened by the gods. But not all rulers brought unity. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, declared the sun disk Aten as the sole deity, banishing the ancient gods. Temples were closed. Priests were silenced. Under his rule, Egypt trembled, not from war, but from spiritual confusion. His queen, the beautiful Nefertiti, stood beside him, her gaze immortalized in a sculpture never fully finished. Its missing eye perhaps a symbol of her vanished fate. After Akhenaten's death, his young son Tutankhamun tried to restore the old ways, but his life was cut short at 14, leaving behind a tomb, a legacy, and whispers of a curse. Centuries later, Ramses II, the warrior pharaoh, would rise to greatness. With bold campaigns and awe-inspiring monuments, he fought at Kadesh and claimed peace with the Hittites, the first treaty known in history. His statues stood as if time could not touch him. Yet time always wins. Egypt began to fracture. Foreign rulers came and went. The gods faded into memory, and yet their stories endured. At last came Cleopatra, last to bear the title pharaoh. Born of divine blood but caught in mortal politics, she sought alliance with Rome, with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. Her love affairs were strategies of survival. But destiny is cruel. Alexandria fell, and with it, the last breath of pharaonic Egypt. Cleopatra's death marked the end of an era, but not of the myths. For in the sands of Egypt, in its temples and tombs, the gods still speak. They whisper of creation, love, betrayal, and rebirth. They remind us that even in death, there is always a chance for light to rise again. The stories of Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Horus are not just tales of gods, but of the eternal human yearning to bring order to chaos and to find meaning in the stars. Chapter 2: Blood in the Nile, the Wrath of Sekhmet. As the centuries slipped through the fingers of time like grains of desert sand, Ra's golden light, once unchallenged, began to flicker in the hearts of mortals. The people of Egypt, who once knelt before him and sang his praises, turned their eyes to darker things. Whispers spread of a new power rising. Apophis, the ancient serpent of chaos, was finding worshippers among the ungrateful. The sacred temples stood quiet while shadows gathered in the corners. Ra, who had given men the Nile and the sun, now saw them pour their devotion into the fangs of a serpent. Betrayed by his own creation, Ra's sorrow turned to fury. His heart, once radiant with compassion, burned with divine anger. From this storm of wrath he summoned Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war, daughter of his fire. Her eyes blazed like twin suns, and her breath scorched the air. Ra unleashed her upon the earth not as a guardian, but as a scourge. She roared across the land, a living embodiment of vengeance, and the soil trembled beneath her steps. Villages vanished in her wake. She tore through cities with claws that gleamed like bronze. None were spared. The Nile, once a river of life, turned crimson as if bleeding from the wounds Sekhmet had inflicted. The terrified cries of the people rose to the heavens, but no god dared stop her. Ra's command was law, and Sekhmet's hunger for punishment was unyielding. Mothers wept, priests begged, but the lioness did not blink. Yet even gods have limits. As the blood soaked deeper into the earth, Ra watched his once beautiful creation crumble under the weight of his own wrath. His eyes, heavy with regret, gazed upon the horror he had unleashed. He realized that vengeance had eclipsed justice. He no longer recognized the world he had brought into being. In a desperate attempt to halt the carnage, Ra devised a trick. He ordered vast amounts of beer dyed with red ochre until it mirrored the very blood Sekhmet craved. The blood-colored beer was poured over the land like a sacrificial offering. When Sekhmet arrived, mad with bloodlust, she drank deeply, mistaking it for the gore of her enemies. The intoxication dulled her rage, and her roars faded into silence. She collapsed into a deep slumber, her body curled like a sleeping storm. When Sekhmet awoke, she was changed. The fury had left her, replaced by tenderness and sorrow. No longer a divine weapon, she became Batet, the cat-headed goddess of protection and grace. Her claws now guarded homes instead of tearing them apart. Her eyes no longer sought vengeance, but watched over children and mothers. The Nile, cleansed of blood, flowed freely again. Crops returned, temples reopened, and the people wept, not out of fear, but relief. But they never forgot the lesson carved in fire and fong. The gods, though generous, bore fury like the sun holds fire. From then on, during festivals, red wine was offered in remembrance, not just of Sekhmet's rampage, but of Ra's mercy. Ra, weary of his own emotions, retreated further into the sky. He boarded his solar bark and began his eternal voyage. By day, he sailed across the heavens, shining once more upon the grateful. But at night, his journey became perilous. Deep in the Duat, the underworld, Apophis rose, monstrous and eternal, seeking to devour the sun and plunge the world back into chaos. Every night, Ra faced the serpent, surrounded by loyal gods who aided him in battle. And every morning his victory was marked by sunrise. But it was never easy. The struggle between order and chaos was endless. Each dawn was not a gift, but a triumph. A reminder that light, no matter how faint, always returns. And so, the people of Egypt rose with the sun, whispered prayers to Ra, and left offerings at Sekhmet's altars, now adorned not with blood, but with flowers and sweet-smelling incense. They remembered the day the Nile turned red and trembled, not in fear, but in awe of the god's power and the delicate thread between wrath and grace. In time, stories of Sekhmet's fury would become legend. But the lesson endured. Divinity is not gentle. It is vast, wild, and sometimes devastating. And it was only by honoring both the kindness and fury of the gods that mortals could live in harmony under the eternal gaze of the sun. Words of life and death, the rise of Osiris. Long after Sekhmet's rage had faded into myth and Ra's light had settled into its daily rhythm, the world was handed to a new guardian, Osiris, son of Geb and Nut. Where Ra burned with divine authority, Osiris glowed with quiet wisdom. He was not a god of the sky, but of the earth, of harvest and humanity. With Isis, his sister and queen, at his side, Osiris brought law and order to a world that still trembled from chaos. He didn't rule with fire or fang, but with kindness, and that made him beloved. Osiris walked among mortals, teaching them how to tame the land. Under his guidance, fields of wheat swayed in the Nile breeze, and bread, warm and fragrant, became a sacred gift. He showed them how to weave linen from flax, build with stone, and create laws that brought structure to the scattered. Men no longer feared the night or the floods, for Osiris had given them rhythm, purpose, and the promise of a just ruler. But every light casts a shadow, and Osiris's shadow bore the shape of his brother Seth. While Osiris ruled from fertile valleys and lush deltas, Seth brooded in the desolate deserts beyond the river's edge. The god of chaos, storms, and scorched earth, he watched Osiris with bitter envy. His lands were dry, his temples empty, and his heart a furnace of resentment. What Osiris earned with love, Seth sought with cunning. Their brotherhood fractured the day Osiris, in a moment of divine vulnerability, strayed into the arms of Nephthys, Seth's wife. From that hidden union, Anubis was born, the jackal-headed god destined to shepherd souls. Seth's humiliation twisted into hate, and he began to plot. He would not challenge Osiris in the open. Instead, he planned something more poetic, more cruel. At a grand banquet, Seth presented a beautifully carved sarcophagus, claiming it was a gift for whoever fit inside. Guests laughed and took turns, but none matched the measurements. None but Osiris. Trusting his brother, Osiris climbed in. The lid slammed shut. Seth sealed it with molten lead, and before the guests could react, he hurled it into the Nile. The coffin drifted away, cradling a god like a tomb of silence. The world mourned. Crops withered as though they too grieved. Isis, shattered but unbroken, set out across Egypt, searching for her beloved. Her footsteps echoed in temples and tombs, her tears fed the floods, and her voice called to every whispering breeze. She found the coffin nestled within a tree in distant Byblos. But before she could return it to Egypt, Seth struck again, dismembering Osiris's body and scattering the pieces across the kingdom. Yet Isis's love knew no end. With Nephthys and Anubis at her side, she found every piece. Over sacred lands and hidden shrines, she gathered her husband's remains. Anubis, master of the dead, crafted the first ritual of mummification. With linen, oils, and spells, he wrapped the god in the shroud of eternity. And then, in a moonlit chamber, Isis whispered life back into Osiris, just long enough to conceive Horus, the falcon child destined to rise. Osiris could no longer dwell among the living. His soul, now bound to the world beneath, became ruler of the underworld, Duat. There, he judged the dead with the scales of Ma'at. He did not seek vengeance, nor did he rage. His role was solemn, to weigh the hearts of the departed against the feather of truth. In his court, justice lived and chaos was denied entry. In the reeds and marshes, hidden from Seth's reach, Isis cradled her newborn son. Her lullabies were not only of love but of destiny. Horus would grow not just as a child but as a symbol, a flame passed from father to son, from sky to earth, from myth to legacy. His wings would one day rise, and with them the fate of Egypt. Thus, the story of Osiris became more than myth. It was the rhythm of the Nile, the promise of rebirth, and the eternal cycle of life, death, and justice. The god who had died for the world became its guardian beneath the soil, watching, waiting, and guiding the souls of kings and peasants alike. Chapter 4. The Falcon and the Storm. Horus against Seth. In the hush of dawn, beneath the swaying reeds of the Nile's edge, a child stirred beneath the protective wings of Isis. Horus was not born into peace, but into exile. The boy with the head of a falcon and eyes like the morning sky was hidden away from the jealous eyes of Seth, who still ruled the world above with a storm-racked fist. Isis whispered spells to veil her son, and every blade of grass, every insect, every breeze became her ally in keeping him safe. But Horus, even as a boy, burned with purpose. His father's throne waited. As Horus grew, so too did his questions. Who was the god who ruled in terror? What had become of his noble father? The truth, when told, ignited a fire that could not be doused. Horus vowed not just to reclaim the throne, but to restore order to a world bent beneath the weight of Seth's chaos. Word spread like a ripple across the Nile. Horus had come of age, and the rightful heir was ready to challenge the usurper. The gods, ever watchful, convened. From the deep chambers of the celestial court, Ra presided. The contest could not be decided by blood alone. This was a matter of divine legitimacy. And so began a trial unlike any Egypt had seen, where strength met cunning, and honor danced with deception. Horus and Seth clashed again and again, not only in the open but in riddles, in transformations, in rituals older than time. In one trial, they became hippopotamuses and sank beneath the Nile, agreeing to remain submerged for 3 full moons. Seth, a creature of rage and stubbornness, endured the pressure of the deep. But Isis, fearing for her son, approached the waters with a harpoon. She saw Seth vulnerable, his godly strength momentarily softened by the current. She hesitated. He was her brother. She spared him, and Horus, upon learning this, turned on his mother in fury. The falcon god severed her head in a moment of rage. But even broken gods are not abandoned. Thoth, the wise and gentle scribe of the heavens, found the fallen Isis and gave her a new head, the head of a cow, restoring her to life and symbolizing her gentleness and patience reborn. Yet the wounds of the divine family deepened. Love, betrayal, forgiveness, and vengeance spiraled in a dance that blurred even the judgment of the gods. Seth's treachery escalated. One night, cloaked in false peace, he invited Horus to his palace. In the darkness, he sought to humiliate and defile his nephew, hoping to render him unworthy of the throne. But Horus, sharp and cunning, turned the act against Seth. With Isis's help, he laced lettuce leaves with his own divine essence and fed them to the unsuspecting god. When Seth consumed them, thinking himself victorious, a disk of light erupted from his forehead, an omen of shame and defeat. This final humiliation turned the tides. The gods could no longer deny Horus. 80 years of conflict came to an end with a verdict from Ra himself. Horus was the true king, not by might alone, but by endurance, wit, and unwavering devotion to order. Seth was not cast into shadow, however. Even in defeat, he was given purpose, to ride with Ra in the solar bark, guarding it from Apophis each night. The god of chaos became a guardian of light, proving that even the wildest storm has its place in the cosmos. Isis, her heart both wounded and proud, watched her son ascend to the throne once held by Osiris. The court erupted with praise, the Nile glittered with celebration, and Egypt breathed a new rhythm under Horus's reign. No longer was he the child in hiding. He was Pharaoh, Falcon of Justice, protector of Maat. And from his line, the tradition of divine kingship flowed like the river itself. Every pharaoh who donned the crown would claim descent from Horus, would embody his triumph, and would bear the weight of the same sacred oath, to guard order, preserve truth, and honor the gods who wove the world from light and shadow. Chapter 5. The Divine Bloodline, Pharaohs of Flesh and Eternity. With Horus on the throne and the balance of Maat restored, the heavens and earth exhaled in harmony. Egypt flourished once more, and the world, newly stitched together with the golden thread of justice, watched as Horus ruled with wisdom inherited from Osiris and fire tempered by Isis. But Horus was not merely a god upon the throne. He was the beginning of a lineage that would blur the boundary between mortal and divine. The pharaohs were born, not simply as rulers, but as living vessels of the gods themselves. To the people, pharaohs were not men. They were Horus made flesh, walking the land, ensuring the Nile's rhythm, the sky's order, and the sun's rise. Each ruler was believed to carry divine blood in their veins, a fragment of the immortal within the mortal. Only those descended from the gods could sit upon the throne, and this sacred inheritance became the very heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. The crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a mantle of cosmic responsibility. From the highlands of Upper Egypt to the sprawling deltas in the north, small villages and scattered tribes began to unite under Pharaoh's banner. In time, these regions, Upper and Lower Egypt, were joined through conquest and diplomacy by a king whose name, wrapped in the mists of time, may have been Narmer or perhaps Menes. He bore the double crown, red and white, signifying the unification of the two lands. This first great pharaoh was said to be descended directly from Horus, a divine warrior who brought peace not with fire, but with vision. Under his reign, the city of Memphis rose from the fertile earth, its temples glowing in the light of Ra, its docks bustling with goods from across the known world. Egypt was no longer a patchwork of rival chieftains. It had become a kingdom, shaped by the will of gods and guided by the wisdom of kings who saw themselves as sacred guardians. Pharaohs were more than rulers. They were high priests, generals, and keepers of the truth. Their days were consumed by rituals, offerings, decrees, and judgments. Even as children, they were prepared for this burden, trained in military tactics, schooled in sacred texts, and immersed in the rites that would one day connect them to the gods. The throne demanded not just might, but purity and discipline, for the pharaoh's failure would ripple through the heavens, threatening the balance of all things. But divine right did not make one invincible. Egypt's enemies lurked at its borders, Nubians in the south, tribes from Lebanon in the north, hungry for the land's rich soil and divine prestige. In times of strife, alliances were forged through marriage. Queens rose to prominence, some even taking the crown themselves. When no male of divine blood remained, the god's will was believed to flow through a daughter or sister. Egypt did not fear a queen, for in their eyes, Isis had ruled with strength equal to any king. And so, the line of pharaohs continued, stretching across centuries like a living thread sewn through the fabric of history. To secure their legacy, they built monuments that kissed the sky, temples and tombs of limestone and granite, carved with tales of conquest and blessings. Their names, etched in hieroglyphs, became eternal. Even as their bodies turned to dust, their voices sang through the stones. These rulers knew their time on earth was fleeting, but their place in the cosmos was not. Each pharaoh prepared for death not as an end, but as a second coronation, a passage into the afterlife where they would rule beside Osiris. Their tombs were not graves, but gates. Their sarcophagi are not coffins, but thrones of the underworld. Death was transformation, not defeat, and through it all one truth endured. Whether born in palaces or born of stone, every pharaoh bore the spirit of Horus. They were the light of the gods on earth, the bridge between mortals and the eternal, the heartbeat of Egypt itself. As long as pharaohs walked the land, Egypt would stand, not just as a kingdom, but as a divine promise carved into time. Chapter 6: Stones of the Sky, the Secret of the Pyramids. As pharaohs ruled with the authority of gods and the legacy of Horus pulsed through their veins, they turned their eyes toward eternity. Life on earth, though sacred, was merely the first chapter. The afterlife awaited, and to reach it, they would need more than prayers and divine blood. They would need monuments that pierced the veil between life and death. Thus began the age of the pyramids, mountains not carved by nature, but by man's devotion and the pharaoh's hunger for immortality. The first great experiment in stone rose in the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. His architect was not merely a builder, but a legend, Imhotep, a man of staggering intellect and mystery. With knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and the divine arts, Imhotep designed the step pyramid of Saqqara, a stairway for the soul. Unlike anything seen before, it was not made for the living, it was a machine for resurrection. Every block, every chamber, echoed with prayers and purpose. It was the first glimpse of how far pharaohs would go to conquer death. Soon, grander visions emerged. In the sands of Giza, the horizon began to shift. The pyramid of Khufu rose like a second sun, its sides gleaming with polished limestone that captured the daylight and cast it across the desert. It was a feat of divine engineering, a testament to Egypt's power. Not only did it reflect the glory of the pharaoh, but it echoed the primeval mound from which creation had first emerged, a pyramid in form and in spirit. To build these monuments, an army of workers was summoned. Not slaves, but free men, laborers who believed they were building heaven itself. They toiled in quarries and hauled granite across vast distances, floating the stones on barges along the Nile. Using ropes, sleds, and raw human will, they dragged each block up ramps toward the sky. Every stone was a prayer. Every ramp was a promise. For their labor, they were fed, sheltered, and revered. Their hands shaped eternity. Inside the pyramids, chambers were carved to house more than the dead. The walls were painted with spells from the pyramid texts, words of power to guide the soul through the treacherous underworld. Items of earthly pleasure, jewelry, wine, chariots, even beloved pets, were buried alongside the king. Some tombs bore curses meant to guard against intruders. The dead pharaoh was no longer a man. He had become Osiris, risen anew, waiting to sit on his eternal throne beyond the stars. The pyramids were not simply tombs. They were mirrors of the cosmos, aligned with the stars of Orion's belt and the path of the sun. They held secrets known only to the priests and the gods, angles of sacred geometry, tunnels that caught the light on specific days, chambers where only the dead could speak. The pharaoh's body lay in darkness, but his spirit soared among the stars, sailing with Ra through the sky, reborn each dawn. Yet not all pyramids survived. Some collapsed due to flawed terrain or miscalculations. When they did, the architects were executed, their failure seen as a betrayal of the gods' trust. Even so, the dream never died. Dozens more were built, smaller, steeper, hidden, each with its own riddle, its own echo of the divine. Over time, as wealth waned and threats mounted, the practice of pyramid building slowed. Pharaohs began to hide their tombs in secret valleys, seeking protection from grave robbers and invaders. But the spirit remained. The belief that one's soul could be preserved, judged, and resurrected, that the journey did not end in death, was eternal. And so the pyramids stood. Even as wind howled across the dunes and centuries passed like drifting sand, they did not crumble. They waited, towers of silence and memory, sculpted prayers of a people who believed in forever. A whisper from stone to sky, saying, "We were here, we still are." Chapter 7. The Sun's Betrayal, Akhenaten and the Lost God. In the golden heart of the new kingdom, when Egypt's temples echoed with hymns to 100 gods, a strange and unexpected silence fell. It began not with thunder or fire, but with a single man, a pharaoh who dared to close his ears to the chants of the ancients and instead listen to the quiet warmth of the sun. His name was Akhenaten, and his reign would divide the heavens. He was not born a rebel. He inherited the throne with the weight of tradition pressed upon his shoulders. Pharaoh, priest, warrior, God on earth. But as the priests of Ammonius whispered in his court and the statues of old deities loomed over the cities, Akhenaten turned his gaze upward. There, in the boundless sky, he saw the Aten, not a god in the shape of beast or man, but the radiant sun disk, its rays ending in hands that offered life to all. To Akhenaten, this was not one god among many. It was the only one. His transformation was swift and absolute. He changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, meaning he who is useful to Aten. He declared that Aten alone was the true source of life, abolishing the old gods whose names had shaped Egypt for millennia. Temples to Ra, Osiris, Thoth, and Isis were closed. Their statues were defaced, their priests cast into silence. In their place, Akhenaten built a new city from dust and dream, Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, a kingdom of sunlight and solitude. In the new capital, walls bore images not of wars and conquests, but of domestic life. The pharaoh playing with his children, walking hand in hand with his queen Nefertiti. She stood beside him, radiant and regal, her face immortalized in a sculpture so lifelike that even gods might envy it. Together, they praised the Aten in daily rituals, believing that all life flowed from its light. Theirs was a love that seemed to defy time, until time turned against them. While Akhenaten worshipped the light, shadows crept across his empire. Egypt's allies grew restless. Enemies tested her borders. The priests of the old gods plotted in silence, their temples dark but not defeated. Trade faltered. Trust withered. The people grew confused, torn between tradition and a new, unseen divinity that offered no myths, no stories, only the warmth of a distant sun. Then, one by one, the pillars of Akhenaten's life began to fall. Nefertiti vanished from records, her fate unknown. Some say she died. Others whisper she took the throne herself under another name. Akhenaten became more isolated, his once brilliant court turning into a quiet cult. Even his children, born into this new sunlit order, seemed uncertain of their place in a kingdom with only one god and no familiar faces in the heavens. When Akhenaten died, his revolution died with him. The old gods returned like a tide breaking through a dam. The temples reopened. The statues were raised anew. His own son, Tutankhamun, renounced his father's name and became Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. The capital of the Aten was abandoned to the sand, its walls left to crumble under a sun that no longer ruled alone. But the legacy of Akhenaten did not vanish entirely. His city, though buried, would one day be rediscovered. His name, once erased from monuments, would be whispered again in museums and scrolls. And his vision, strange, fragile, radiant, remained a question carved in stone. What if there was only one light in the sky, and all life was just a dance in its warmth? Akhenaten's was not a failure, but a dream too wild for its time. A moment when one man believed he could remake the heavens and be heard by a god who spoke only in light. A moment that proved even the sun can be a lonely god. Chapter 8. The Boy King and the Whispering Tomb, Tutankhamun's Short Reign. In the soft shadows that followed Akhenaten's blinding sun, Egypt found itself in quiet disarray. The temples had reopened, but the trust of the gods needed to be rebuilt. The nation, exhausted from divine upheaval and political confusion, turned its hopes to a boy barely old enough to hold a scepter. His name was Tutankhamun, the child of a forbidden god and a fractured kingdom. But when the old gods were restored, he too was reborn. His name changed to Tutankhamun, the living image of Ammonius. Crowned pharaoh at the tender age of 9, Tutankhamun sat on a throne that was more symbolic than sovereign. Behind the gold and fanfare, real power moved quietly in the form of Vizier I and the seasoned General Hormheb. Yet even at that young age, the boy king began to pull the strings of his own fate. He ordered the rebuilding of temples and shrines to the forgotten deities. Statues of Ammonius, Osiris, and Horus rose once more from the rubble, as chants echoed through the sanctuaries in voices weary but eager. To mend divine bloodlines and reaffirm tradition, Tutankhamun married his half-sister, Akhenaten. They were both children of chaos, yet together they symbolized a hope for continuity. The court, still echoing with the silence left by the Aten, watched them with the cautious optimism of a people desperate for signs. Egypt's gods, once cast out, seemed to smile again. But even golden crowns cannot protect a fragile body. The boy king suffered ailments from birth. His foot was clubbed, his frame delicate, and his health uncertain. As he grew older, the weight of rule grew heavier. He tried to step out from the shadows of his advisors, to become not just a symbol, but a sovereign. But before his voice could fully deepen, it was silenced. Tutankhamun died at just 19. His sudden death sparked a storm of rumors. Was it disease, an accident, or something darker? Whispers told of betrayal, of poison in a golden chalice, or a conspiracy by those who served him. For some, the name I loomed large, a man who stood beside the boy in life and may have stepped over his body to claim the throne. Akhenaten, now a widow barely older than a child, feared for her life. Desperate, she sent a letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's rival, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and claim the throne. An unthinkable plea. The Hittite prince was dispatched, but he never reached Egypt. His body vanished into the sands before crossing the border. Some say assassins sent by I silenced him forever. Akhenaten had no choice. She was forced to marry I, a man old enough to be her grandfather, possibly her grandfather by blood. Her story ended soon after. History does not remember her death, only that she vanished, as so many women in power did, into the folds of others' ambition. Yet Tutankhamun's story was not over. While his reign had been brief, his afterlife would echo through eternity. Unlike the grand pyramids of his ancestors, his tomb was modest and quickly sealed, perhaps because of the haste of succession, or because those in power wished to bury his memory along with his body. But the tomb was overlooked by grave robbers and forgotten by time. More than 3,000 years later, in 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered a sealed door beneath the Valley of the Kings. Inside, untouched and gleaming in gold, lay the boy king, his burial chamber, crammed with treasures, wine jars, jewelry, ceremonial chariots, and even 2 tiny mummified daughters, was a miracle of preservation. But with discovery came legend. The curse of the pharaoh, whispered after strange deaths befell some who had entered his tomb. The centerpiece of it all was the golden sarcophagus, 3 coffins nested within one another, the final one made entirely of gold. And inside it, Tutankhamun's fragile body lay, a mummy preserved in mystery. Around him were fragments of a life that was more myth than rule, more prayer than policy. He had died young, but in death he became immortal. Today, Tutankhamun is remembered not for the battles he fought or the lands he ruled, but for the silence he kept. His tomb whispered stories long buried, of love, betrayal, and resurrection. He, the boy pharaoh, gave voice to a vanished world, reminding us that even the briefest flickers of life can cast the longest shadows through history. Chapter 9. The Warrior Pharaoh Ramses the Great and the Battle of Kadesh. In the wake of young Tutankhamun's death, Egypt passed through the hands of generals and caretakers, searching once more for strength. It found it in a man of fire and thunder, Ramses II, who would not just wear the crown, but carve his name across the bones of history. He was not merely a king, he was legend made flesh, a storm in human form. The people called him Ramses the Great, and under his rule Egypt would rise to glory one last time. Born the son of Pharaoh Seti I, Ramses was raised in the dust of military camps and among scrolls that told of divine ancestry. From boyhood, he rode chariots and listened to priests chant the names of Horus and Ra. His father, wise and hardened, prepared him for rule not with silk, but with iron. By the time Ramses took the throne, he was already seasoned, anointed by blood, fire, and the gods. His ambition knew no limits. Cities flourished under his command. Temples rose like mountains in honor of gods old and new. The grandest of these was Abu Simbel, carved into cliffs along the Nile, its colossal statues staring into eternity. But while artisans shaped stone in his image, Ramses himself was shaping destiny on the battlefield. His greatest challenge came in the form of the Hittites, a powerful empire to the north, whose reach stretched into Syria and beyond. The two kingdoms collided at a place called Kadesh, where the Orontes River curved through the land like a drawn bow. It was here that Ramses would ride into legend and into the jaws of an ambush. Believing false intelligence, Ramses advanced with only part of his army, unaware that the Hittites lay in wait. The trap snapped shut, and chaos erupted. Ramses, caught with his royal guard, fought not like a pharaoh, but like a god of war. Driving his chariot straight into enemy lines, he cut a path through thousands, his armor gleaming like sunlight on bronze. His soldiers rallied, the remaining divisions arrived, and the tide turned. Though the battle ended without a clear victor, Ramses claimed divine triumph. Egypt's temples told tales of his bravery with such flourish that even time dared not challenge them. Yet, beneath the carved reliefs and soaring hymns, something real pulsed. Ramses had led his men into fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The aftermath of Kadesh led to a remarkable outcome, the world's first recorded peace treaty. Ramses and the Hittite king exchanged oaths of friendship, sealed with gold tablets and royal marriages. It was not just a treaty between nations, but a promise between civilizations, and Ramses, clever and calculating, turned it into a monument of his wisdom. His reign stretched for over 6 decades. He fathered over 100 children and outlived many of them. His rule was marked by prosperity, vast building projects, and a state machinery that worshipped him as a living god. Yet as time passed, his figure became less man and more myth. He watched generations come and go, his image sculpted larger and grander each year, as if to defy the inevitable. In his final years, Ramses moved like a shadow through palaces he had built. His body aged but his gaze sharp. He had defeated enemies, loved queens, built cities and walked among gods. And when he finally closed his eyes, Egypt trembled. Not in fear, but in awe. His mummy, when discovered centuries later, bore the face of a king who had stared down mortality. Worn but unyielding, his features told the story of a man who dared to live like a deity and nearly succeeded. Ramses the Great did not leave behind a single legacy. He left an empire of memories, etched in sandstone, sung in temples, and whispered through the lips of history. He had ruled like Ra in full blaze, and even in death, his name glowed, burning with the echo of a king who tried to outrun time. Chapter 10. The Fall of the Gods, the Sea Peoples, and the Fracturing of Egypt. The death of Ramses the Great cast a long shadow over Egypt. His throne passed to sons and grandsons, but none could hold the scepter as firmly or wear the crown with the same commanding grace. The land of the Nile, once fortified by divine rule and warrior might, began to tremble beneath threats that came not from deserts or kingdoms, but from the sea. And with these new invaders came a storm that would fracture the heart of an empire. They came in waves, swift and strange, like phantoms from the deep. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, a confederation of tribes whose names have faded like footprints on shifting sand. They were fierce, fearless, and relentless, bringing with them chariots, fire, and hunger. Unlike other enemies, they brought no treaties, no demands, only destruction. Their origins remain uncertain, perhaps from the Aegean or the shattered coasts of Anatolia, but their path was clear: conquest. The Mediterranean trembled as these invaders swept through kingdoms like a tide of fire. The Mycenaeans fell. The Hittites vanished beneath their assault. The great cities of the Bronze Age were reduced to rubble and ash. And soon, their sails darkened the horizon of Egypt. Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramses II, faced them in his old age. Weak in body but sharpened by crisis, he summoned what strength remained and met the Sea Peoples at the Delta. The battle was fierce and brutal. Arrows rained from Egyptian bows, and war chariots thundered across the sands. The Sea Peoples were beaten back for now. Egypt had survived, but only barely. Its people, weary from war, watched as famine followed. The Nile's floods became unpredictable, crops failed, and the economy withered. Temples still rang with hymns, but the gods no longer answered as swiftly. Years later, Ramses III, another of the long line bearing that sacred name, would again face the sea peoples. This time, they struck with more force, more numbers and desperate fury. But Ramses III, clever and ruthless, prepared a trap. He lured them into narrow waters, where Egyptian ships, specially constructed for agility, ambushed them in a coordinated assault. On land, archers and infantry crushed the remnants. It was a victory, celebrated in carvings and scrolls, but it came at a terrible cost. The empire was bled dry, its treasury emptied, its people starving, and its gods questioned. Egypt's once flawless governance began to rot from within. Corruption spread like rot through the court. Food was rationed, and unrest brewed. The laborers, unpaid and hungry, refused to work, marking the first recorded labor strike in human history. Even the divine glow of the pharaoh began to dim. Then, in a quiet yet devastating betrayal, Ramses III was murdered. His throat slit as part of a harem conspiracy, led by one of his own wives. She sought to place her son on the throne. The pharaoh's final moments were not spent in the glory of battle or the splendor of ritual, but in the cold silence of treachery. With his death, Egypt fell deeper into chaos. The priests of Ammonius grew powerful, controlling Thebes and manipulating the throne. Regional rulers declared independence. Foreigners seized border cities. For the first time in centuries, the land that had once claimed divine unity fractured into warring pieces. The gods still stood in their temples, but their voices were faint, drowned out by the clamor of men who no longer believed or no longer listened. Egypt, the eternal, had begun to crumble, not with a crash, but with a slow and aching sigh. And yet the pyramids still stood against the wind, the Nile still flowed, and the stories still lived, waiting for another soul to remember what it meant to be divine. Chapter 11. Shadows over the Two Lands, the Rise of the Priests and the Third Intermediate Period. As the royal bloodline thinned and the divine voice of the pharaohs grew faint, a new power stirred, not from foreign invaders, but from within the sacred halls of Egypt's own temples. In Thebes, cloaked in incense and silence, the priests of Ammonius began to weave themselves into the fabric of rule. They claimed no thrones, wore no crowns, but their influence seeped into every corner of the land, like a river changing its course in the dark. The pharaohs still sat upon thrones in name, but their reach no longer stretched from Delta to Nubia. Instead, the land fractured into fragments, each ruled by warlords, priests, or foreign-born kings who wrapped themselves in the symbols of Egyptian royalty. The once mighty kingdom splintered into rival dynasties. In the north, kings of Libyan blood declared themselves pharaohs. In the south, the priesthood ruled Thebes as a holy theocracy, controlling temples and treasuries with the quiet authority of gods made flesh. The priest-kings of Ammonius wrapped themselves in linen and spoke with divine command. They did not lead armies or build pyramids. They led ceremonies, guarded secrets, and read omens. Some believed they were the rightful successors of the pharaohs, chosen not by blood but by the gods themselves. Others saw them as parasites, feeding on the remains of a dying empire. Either way, their power was real. Offerings once meant for the gods were now currency for influence, and temples became fortresses of the soul. The chaos of power bred new enemies. To the east, the Assyrians watched Egypt's slow unraveling with hunger in their eyes. Strong, brutal, and unforgiving, the Assyrians had already crushed Babylon and laid waste to neighboring lands. They descended upon Egypt like a storm of iron, sweeping through cities and installing their own governors. The proud temples of ancient gods bowed beneath foreign banners. The chants once meant for Osiris and Horus now carried foreign names and alien echoes. Even still, resistance flickered. In Nubia, far to the south, a new force rose, black pharaohs of Kush, who claimed descent from the gods and marched north to reclaim Egypt's soul. For a brief moment, the dream returned. Statues were raised again, temples rededicated, and Ma'at, the divine order, felt near once more. But time, ever patient, wore down even the most righteous of rebellions. Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom, but a memory scattered across shifting sands. The people still prayed, still built, still buried their dead with care, but the rhythm had changed. The land of Horus, Ra, and Isis had become a mosaic of rulers and beliefs, a place where gods watched in silence as mortals vied for what was left. In this long twilight, even the gods changed. Some faded. Others were merged with foreign deities, their stories rewritten by invaders and new priests. And yet, in villages along the Nile, farmers still poured water into the river at sunrise. Mothers still whispered the name of Isis when they feared for their children. And scribes still carved the eye of Horus into the tombs of the forgotten. The spirit of Egypt had not died. It had simply gone underground, buried like a seed waiting for spring. In the hearts of its people, beneath layers of dust and ruin, the ancient magic still pulsed, soft, quiet, and eternal. Chapter 12. The Stranger Kings, Persians, Greeks, and the Shifting Sands of Power. As centuries unfurled like faded scrolls, Egypt, once the golden cradle of gods and kings, became a prize in the eyes of distant empires. Its deserts, tombs, and temples whispered promises of power, and one by one, foreign kings came not to worship but to conquer. The divine blood of Horus still lingered in memory, but it was now worn like a costume by men whose gods bore other names. The first to strike were the Persians, led by Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great. He swept into Egypt with swift, calculating fury. The priests of Ammonius, long silent from internal strife, found themselves bending their knees to a foreigner who wrapped himself in the trappings of Pharaoh while speaking in the tongue of Persia. Cambyses declared himself chosen by Ra, though few believed his voice echoed with divine favor. Still, he spared the temples, for even conquerors feared the curse of forgotten gods. The Persians ruled Egypt not through slaughter, but through suffocation. Their satraps governed with cold precision, draining the land of grain and gold. Temples were taxed, tombs plundered, and art stilled. Yet the people endured. They lit oil lamps to Thoth at night and prayed quietly to Hathor, even as they paid tribute in the name of Ahura Mazda. Resistance stirred in brief flashes, but the gods remained patient. They had seen conquerors before. Eventually, Persia's grip weakened, and another stranger arrived, not with legions of soldiers, but with a mind sharpened by dreams. Alexander the Great, the Lion of Macedonia, marched into Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of Persian yokes, welcomed him as a new Horus, a foreign king who wore native garb and offered sacrifice to the gods of old. In Memphis, he was crowned pharaoh, and in the oracle of Siwa, the priests declared him the son of Ammonius. With reverence and calculation, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria, a gleaming beacon of stone and scholarship on the Mediterranean coast. It was to be his gift to the world, a city of knowledge, of light, of eternity. But Alexander, God-touched and flame-bright, died young, far from the land he honored. His body, said to have been entombed in Egypt, vanished into legend. After him came his generals, the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt like a borrowed crown. Though they spoke Greek and honored their Hellenic gods, they understood the power of tradition. They styled themselves as pharaohs, adopted Egyptian rituals, and married their own blood, echoing the ancient customs of divine kingship. The gods of Egypt and Greece merged. Isis was worshipped beside Aphrodite. Thoth stood next to Hermes. The two worlds began to blur. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a fusion, a place of scrolls and scroll burners, of mummies and marble. The great library of Alexandria grew into a sanctuary of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the earth. It was said that all the world's wisdom lived within its walls, maps of the stars, anatomy of the human body, spells, epics, and histories whispered in dozens of tongues. But power, like the Nile, shifts its course. Greed and betrayal fractured the Ptolemaic court. Sibling fought sibling, lovers became rivals, and Rome, that rising wolf across the sea, began to circle. Egypt was no longer the untouchable kingdom of the gods. It had become a chessboard for empires. And yet, amid the changing winds, the temples still stood. The priests still lit incense to Ra at dawn. The people still carved scarabs into stone and wrapped their dead in sacred linen. Egypt had changed its face, but not its soul. The gods, though quiet, had not departed. They watched as foreigners claimed their thrones, bearing new names but performing the same ancient rites. It was a new chapter in an old book, and though the language had changed, the heart of Egypt still beat beneath it all, slow and steady, waiting for the final verse. Chapter 13. The Last Pharaoh, Cleopatra, and the End of the Divine Bloodline. In the twilight of the Ptolemaic dynasty, when Egypt teetered between ancient memory and Roman ambition, a queen rose whose name would echo louder than any before her. She was Cleopatra, daughter of the Nile, heir to gods, and the final thread in a tapestry woven by Ra, Isis, and centuries of divine rule. Her beauty became legend, but her true power lay in her voice, her wit, and her defiant heart. Born into a palace of gold and poison, Cleopatra was no mere ornament of the throne. She spoke multiple languages, studied astronomy, philosophy, and law, and understood that to rule Egypt in its final hour would require not charm, but brilliance. Her siblings plotted against her. Her people hungered for guidance, and Rome, vast and insatiable, loomed like a shadow over the Mediterranean. Yet she stood alone, unwavering, a pharaoh in a world that no longer believed in gods. When she first met Julius Caesar, it was not as a supplicant, but as a strategist. Wrapped in a carpet, she entered his chambers not as prey, but as a player in a game of empires. Caesar, intrigued by her intellect and seduced by her ambition, made her queen again, toppling her brother's forces and securing her throne. Together, they forged a fragile alliance. Egypt and Rome, old gods and new. Their union bore a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra named the heir not only of Rome but of Egypt's divine legacy. In her heart, she believed that through him, the line of Horus would survive, reborn in a new empire. But fate, like the Nile, changed course. Caesar was murdered in the Roman Senate, and the world turned once more to war. It was then that Cleopatra met Mark Antony, Rome's lion-hearted general. Their bond was both passionate and political. In him, Cleopatra saw strength and protection. In her, Antony saw destiny and flame. Their romance enraged Rome, which saw in Cleopatra not a queen, but a sorceress seducing their hero. Propaganda painted her as a serpent, a temptress. But in truth, she was a ruler trying to save her kingdom from being swallowed whole. Their final stand came at the Battle of Actium, where Roman ships clashed with the fleets of Cleopatra and Antony. The sea turned red, and fate turned cruel. They were defeated not just by swords, but by history's tide. Antony, wounded and misled, took his own life. Cleopatra, heartbroken but unbroken, returned to Alexandria, her city of marble and fading gods. As Octavian's forces closed in, she made one final choice: to deny Rome the satisfaction of parading her in chains. Draped in royal linen, surrounded by relics of her ancestors, Cleopatra let an asp sink its fangs into her skin. The bite was quick, the silence afterward eternal. Her death marked not just the end of her life, but the end of something far greater. With Cleopatra died the last pharaoh, the last voice of Ra's chosen, the final queen who spoke with the gods. Egypt fell into Roman hands and became a province, its temples looted, its gods mocked or forgotten. The divine line that had begun with Horus, that had weathered storms, invasions, and centuries of glory, was now a relic in stone and scroll. But legends do not fade so easily. Cleopatra's name endured, embroidered into plays, poems, and paintings. Some remembered her as a seductress, others as a tragic queen. But Egypt remembered her differently, as the final guardian of the old ways, the last soul who spoke to the gods not with fear, but as one of them. And even today, when her name is whispered, it is not just her story we recall, but the echo of a civilization that once believed its rulers were stars walking the earth. Through her, the gods of Egypt sang their final song, and then, like the sun setting over the Nile, fell into myth. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Sand: The Death and Rebirth of a Civilization. With Cleopatra's final breath, Egypt's crown passed not to a descendant of Horus, but to Rome, a foreign power that had once admired the Nile's majesty from afar and now claimed it as its own. The temples still stood, casting long shadows across the desert, but their sanctuaries grew cold. The priests, once the beating heart of Egypt's divine machinery, were stripped of power. Offerings dwindled, statues were toppled. The gods, once nourished by song and sacrifice, began to fade into silence. The Roman emperors added their names to the long line of kings carved into temple walls. But the people knew the truth. These were not pharaohs, not children of Ra or Horus. They were administrators, conquerors, outsiders draped in the echoes of a religion they did not believe. The rituals continued for a time, like empty dances performed for fading applause, but the soul of Egypt was slipping into sleep. Alexandria remained a beacon, a city of scholars and scrolls, but even its light dimmed when fire consumed the great library. Flames devoured centuries of knowledge, myths, science, dreams, all turned to smoke. It was said that the gods wept that day, for in those pages lived the last fragile threads that connected mortals to the divine. And yet Egypt did not vanish, transformed. As Christianity spread, the old gods were cast as demons. Their temples turned into churches or left to crumble under sand and time. Isis, once the mother of all life, was now remembered only in whispers, her image replaced by saints and martyrs. Hieroglyphs, sacred language of kings and the afterlife, became meaningless etchings to future generations, mysteries without a key. For centuries, Egypt was misunderstood, its greatness buried beneath conquest and misunderstanding. Travelers from foreign lands came and marveled at the pyramids, unable to comprehend how a people so ancient could shape stone with such wisdom. Legends grew around the ruins, of sorcerers, giants, and lost knowledge. But none could hear the voices trapped inside the walls, the hymns written for gods long gone. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the cracking of the Rosetta Stone, that Egypt began to whisper again. Scholars, like patient scribes of old, worked to decipher the sacred script. Bit by bit, the stories of Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus came back to life. Tombs were uncovered, mummies unearthed, the silent gods stirred. And in those ruins, humanity rediscovered something more than history. They found awe, the kind that reminds us we are part of something vast and mysterious. They saw in Egypt not just kings and monuments, but the echo of a belief that humans could reach the divine, not through perfection, but through stories, rituals, and legacy. Tourists now walk the same sands where gods once battled and queens once ruled. They touch the walls where pharaohs carved their names, stand beneath pillars that once held up the sky of a nation, and gaze upon statues with eyes that have witnessed thousands of years. Egypt breathes again, not as an empire, but as memory made real. And though the gods may no longer speak in thunder or raise rivers with their tears, their stories live in every carved glyph, every weathered stone, every dream stirred by the Nile's gentle current. Egypt may have fallen, but it was never lost. It simply waited, patient, eternal, for the world to remember. Chapter 15. The Immortality of Myth: How the Gods Endure. Though the temples have crumbled and the last pharaoh is long dust, the gods of Egypt never truly vanished. They live, not in flesh or gold, but in the stories that ripple across time like the Nile itself, ever flowing, ever bending, never ceasing. Where once priests whispered spells by torchlight, now scholars, artists, and dreamers retell their tales in ink and pixels, in paintings, poems, and film. In every retelling, the gods breathe again. Ra still rides his solar bark across the sky each day, if not in the minds of worshippers, then in the heartbeat of sunrise. Isis still weeps for Osiris in the gentle flow of rivers, and Horus still soars where hawks circle the clouds, watching over all that dares to rise again after ruin. Even Seth, the god of chaos and storms, reminds us that destruction is not the end. It is simply part of the eternal cycle of transformation. What the ancient Egyptians knew, and what they tried to teach the world through their monuments, their rituals, and their enduring myths, was that stories are stronger than stone. They knew that when a name is spoken, it is never truly forgotten. That when a heart is light and a life lived with honor, even death itself cannot erase a soul. Their gods weren't just deities. They were mirrors of human emotion. Jealousy, love, courage, vengeance, hope. And so today, thousands of years later, their names still rise from the sands. Museums guard their relics. Writers borrow their legends. Children learn their stories. Anubis still appears in dreams, guiding the lost. Thoth still inspires the seekers of truth. The scarab, once a symbol of rebirth, still adorns jewelry and sacred spaces. Even in cultures far removed, echoes of Egyptian beliefs linger, as symbols of protection, of resurrection, of divine order. It is in this endurance that Egypt achieved what every civilization hopes for: immortality. Not of empire, but of meaning. Not through armies, but through imagination. The pyramids, impossibly old, still stand not as monuments to death, but as lighthouses of memory. The Valley of the Kings, once sealed to time, now welcomes the curious to walk among the dead and listen. And perhaps that was the gods' plan all along, not to be worshipped forever, but to be remembered, to inspire every soul that seeks to build something greater than themselves, to remind us that beyond the dust and silence, beyond the fall of kings and the rise of strangers, there is still wonder. There is still the divine. So, when the wind howls across the dunes, or the sun sets in perfect symmetry behind an ancient obelisk, listen closely. For in that moment Egypt speaks, not with the voice of conquest, but with the soft, enduring whisper of myth. A whisper that says, we were here, we loved, we ruled, we fell, but we never truly left, and neither did the gods.